Joining me now is CEO and co-founder of the Texas Tribune, as well as the host of Overheard with Evan Smith on PBS stations across the country, Mr. Evan Smith, and a host of other things too. I didn't want to get all of that stuff in there.
It gets boring after the first couple lines, though. It's very nice to be with you.
Thank you for being here. And you're looking sharp as usual. I think every time I've ever seen you, you are dressed to the T's.
I only come in one flavor.
I imagine a young Evan Smith, like 7-year-old, looking exactly like this, but just miniature. Is that an accurate portrayal of your
That's probably right. You would imagine me getting beaten up a lot in school. But no, you know, when you run things and when you're in public a fair amount, and the business that you're in and that I'm in, you end up being in front of groups of people all the time, sometimes planned and sometimes unplanned. I figure it's better to hedge and be dressed.
Yes, absolutely.
Right? Yeah.
That is a great philosophy.
That's how that goes.
Yeah, absolutely. And you were born in New York, but you found your way to Texas.
Right. At this point, I can say, you could fact check this. This is true. I've been in Texas more than half my life.
Okay.
And
great.
so if you're not from Texas, as you know and as I know, you can never say you're from if you're not actually from, but you can say you're of. And so I always tell people I'm of Texas, if not from Texas. But it is true that I've now lived here longer than any place else. And they'll carry me across state lines in a pine box. I'm never leaving.
Great. That's great to hear.
I've decided that this is it.
Great. Yeah. Well, and you sort of are, and I will compliment you as sort of a Texas treasure. I think
nice to say.
Your reputation across the state is...
Look, I love this state. You know, when I got here, I realized that the respectful thing to do was to be quiet for a while and listen to people and to try to understand this place that I had chosen as my home. And it also meant striking out and seeing parts of the state that I hadn't seen. I remember the very earliest months and in the first probably year to 2 years that I was in Texas, I spent almost every weekend someplace other than Austin.
Evan, what were some of those career choices past that led you to Texas? Because it's a big wide world out there. What brought you here?
Right, you know, I didn't spend a lot of time in the business not in Texas. I graduated from Northwestern University graduate school in journalism in 1988, and I was in Texas about 3 years later. I spent some time in magazines, first in Knoxville, Tennessee, and then in New York. But you know, back at Northwestern in Evanston, Illinois, an unlikely place to discover Texas, I discovered Texas through Texas Monthly, a magazine that I had not seen until I got to graduate school, but started reading and immediately loved. And I loved it for two reasons. One is it had an extraordinary grasp of this place, Texas. Texas was evident in every crevice of that magazine. And as somebody who had not been to Texas at that point, I felt like I understood Texas from reading that magazine. They really knew Texas, and they made you know it and care about it as much as they did. Second thing is, it was narrative nonfiction, long-form writing. That magazine did about as well as any I'd ever seen, and I thought, God, if I could work at a magazine like this one day, that would be all I'd ever want to do. And so I started to write letters every couple of months to the editor, to the then editor, Greg Curtis of Texas Monthly, to say basically, I'll come sweep up, just find a place for me somewhere. In those days, it's not so much the case now there or at other magazines, but in those days, particularly Texas Monthly, people came and never left. So you got to the magazine and you'd meet people who had been there since the first month, and they were in jobs and they had no plans to leave. They understood, as we all did outside of it, that it was a great place to be and they were never going to give up that job. And so jobs came open very rarely. But a job came open in the fall of 1991. I found out about it fairly late in the cycle. They were getting ready to hire somebody, it turned out, but I wrote to the editor for the millionth time and I said, look, I'd like to apply for this job. And he said, well, you know, it's pretty late, but send in your stuff. And so I sent it in and waited, and then they said, okay, we're going to bring you down. We're about to make an offer to this person who we think we're going to hire, but come on down. And boy, I worked that thing to a fare thee well. I was like, I'm not losing out the opportunity to come to get this job. So I got it, and I got to Texas at the end of 1991. And really at that point, I stayed at Texas Monthly for about 18 years, and you know, I understood absolutely why the people who had come early and stayed.
Sure.
Because that was in those days just an unusual place to work. Great people, amazing material to work with. Texas provides all the material from a media standpoint, you know that as well as I do, and the kind of work with integrity that, again, rare to find anywhere else.
Sure, and you stated in there that, you know, you thought if you could work at a place like that, you'd never leave.
Yeah.
But then the Texas Tribune, you know, and what was that decision that you sort of ventured out and decided?
So it's a couple things. I think the first thing was, of course, you say, I'm never going to leave, and then the minute that you drive that car off the lot, the value of the statement drops, right? So you go, I'm never going to leave. Well, of course, that's false. I became the editor of Texas Monthly in July of 2000, and the editor who had preceded me, this guy who I had written for all those months to get a job, and then eventually became my boss and my very good friend, still my very good friend, Greg Curtis. He was the editor for 19 years, which by I think even his own acknowledgement is probably too long. You know, you run an organization, you want to come in every day, eager to do the work and lead the people who you're working with or who work with you. You want to be as enthusiastic about the mission of the place as you were on the first day, maybe ever more ambitious with each succeeding day. And the minute that you begin to go down that other side of the mountain, it's probably a good idea to think about handing off to somebody else. And I was committed to not staying too long. And I knew that on the very first day that I became editor of Texas Monthly, that the key for me was going to be to realize when I was beginning to lose steam, and then to make careful plans to hand the magazine off to somebody in a seamless fashion. And to go look for the person who would be that person, and then take a period of time to groom that person, and then kind of walk out the door. He walks in the door, she walks in the door, and that was it, which is exactly what I did. My decision to leave Texas Monthly to go eventually to start the Texas Tribune was in part an acknowledgement that I had run out of gas. I'd done, I think, 5 or 6 barbecue covers on the, in all the, I'm a vegetarian, so I have to tell you that by the 5th barbecue cover, I was like, all right, enough already.
Which we just had one a couple months ago, I think.
Well, and it's of course wildly popular, but at a certain point, you're like, all right, enough with the brisket. Sure. I've actually had it. But honestly, it was as much about leaving there as it was about going here. In the time that I was at Texas Monthly, 2 things happened. Over the many years, I began to think it was probably a good idea to give the control of the place to somebody else. But I also began to notice with some alarm that coverage of politics, which is really my thing, that everybody loves some aspect of what they do, and I loved political journalism under the umbrella of journalism, most of all. So I pay careful attention to that. I'm always aware of what's going on in the news. I'm really interested in elections. And as a kid, some people count sheep to go to sleep. I used to try to name all 100 United States senators. I remember the first election I remember closely following was the Carter-Ford election in 1976. I was 10 years old. Every 4 years is like Christmas and the Super Bowl and the Olympics all at once for me. I just love that stuff. So I paid careful attention to political journalism over those years, and I began to notice with some alarm that the number of places in business that covered politics had declined. There used to be 2 newspapers in Houston, then there was suddenly 1. There were 2 newspapers in Dallas, then there was suddenly 1. And the number of reporters at the Capitol was also declining. In fact, it was a third the size, the press corps was a third the size when I left Texas Monthly of what it had been when I got there. And I was concerned about this, and I was concerned about journalism. This was a period of time, you remember, in the first decade of this century when the business was contracting. People were losing their jobs, newsrooms were laying people off, and news organizations were shutting down or consolidating. And so a venture capitalist friend of mine, guy with a lot of money and I think a big heart then and now, said, let's see if we can't figure out a new model for doing serious journalism that will rectify or reverse this problem of declining coverage.
And I think that's something that at the time seemed really remarkable, because there was a lot of talk of it's over.
It seems stupid.
Yeah. Now it's like, of course, there was an evolution.
Yeah, and it seems stupid to no one more than to us. I think that if anybody has been surprised, as we sit here today, tomorrow, the 3rd of November, will be the 8th anniversary of the Tribune's launch. We'll be in business as of tomorrow, 8 years.
Congratulations.
And if you go back, it's not too late to send a card. But as I say, if you go back 8 years, though, and the day that we flipped the switch on this thing, no one would have been more surprised than we would have been if you had said 8 years from now you'll have been successful and grown as significantly as you've grown, win awards, and help not only change the conversation about the future of journalism in Texas, but around the country and even around the world. We're being emulated, the work that we do, the model, the economic model supports the work that we do, and the content model, the approach to covering news and to doing robust databases of journalism and data visualizations, or database of information, I should say, and data visualizations, and to do as many events as we do all over with elected officials in front of an audience. That combination is now being replicated in a lot of other places. There are little Texas Tribunes starting up all over the country and in some countries around the world, and we love that and love the fact that we've been able to develop what are effectively best practices for the future of journalism. I have to tell you, we would have been shocked to learn that. And I think we've learned a ton over these 8 years, and I think we've made mistakes. Of course, you make mistakes, plenty of mistakes, and you learn from them. What we've never done is gotten risk averse, and I think this is the biggest. If there's one thing that in the 8 years we've learned, it's that you've got to take chances on things that might or might not work. But if they're done in service to being great and awesome and fulfilling your mission, it's worth trying. And if it doesn't work, you figure out, what did I learn from that experience, and then you move on. Most places are so concerned about the immediate future that they can't afford to take risks.
Absolutely. And do you feel like we're at another one of those, I don't want to say it's, crossroads or something of that nature, but we're living in a very interesting time for the media.
Sure.
And for political media.
Sure.
Right now, of course, just recently the head CEOs, or not all the CEOs went, but some head people at some of the technology companies went in front of Congress to talk about
right.
The meddling by foreign government into our own elections and those types of
right.
things. What do you see? Prognosticate for me what you see in this transitionary time.
Right. Well, the first thing to say is that technology has changed everything. It seems like an obvious thing to say, but it bears saying regardless, because we forget how quickly everything is moving and how things that we now take for granted today didn't even exist just a couple of years ago. So we started, as I said, 8 years ago. 8 years ago, there were no tablets. First iPad came out about 6 months after we launched the Texas Tribune. There was no Snapchat, there was no Instagram, there was no Slack. Many of the tools of communicating internally and externally with people inside your little organization or out to the world, if you're a news organization or some other kind of media company, just did not even exist as recently as 8 years ago. This stuff is all happening so fast, and we as organizations have an obligation to try as best we can to keep up. It's very difficult. So that's one set of challenges over here. The second set of challenges is that the news, if you're in the news business particularly, is coming at you like a fire hose these days. Everything that happens is, hair on fire, breaking news for about 5 minutes. And then something else comes along and pushes that thing off the front page or off the air. And it used to be that many of the things that happen today in the old days would have been on the front page of a newspaper for a week. And we would have taken a long time to think and talk about them. And the reality is now there's no time even to catch your breath. This is a little bit like Indiana Jones journalism. You are at risk of being crushed by a boulder unless you keep running and never look behind you. Yeah. And I think that's the problem, is that we've gotten now to a place where we can't even process and analyze and contextualize things. We just have to race ahead as fast as possible or the boulder will get us. So it is a really remarkable moment to be in this business. And then layer on top of that the fact that the president is incentivizing people or inciting people to hate us, if not to take violent action against us. I mean, the reality, another big reality that's different from the 8 years before we started the Tribune to now, is that the default setting used to be that people trusted the media, and now the default setting is that people don't. And so we have to get up in the morning every day realizing that we're pushing against this sense that we're not credible, honest, worthy, and we have to work overtime to persuade people just of that basic set of things. And so it's really complicated. But at the same time, I have to tell you, Paul, that I would much rather be doing this work now. I think there's something exhilarating about the challenges that we all face in the media business, and in the news business particularly. The competitive set has changed. There are many more people who are journalists. All you need is cheap technology, and you're every bit as important as anybody else. The problem, and I do think it's a legitimate problem of distinguishing from fake news from real news. Those of us who are in the real news business and have been in the real news business longer than we've been talking about fake news, I think it creates opportunities for us to figure out new ways to do our jobs better and to reach people. And I think that you couldn't ask for a crazier, in the more interesting sense, political universe than the one that we're in right now. And so every day it's just, there's 150 things that you'd love to be able to clone yourself and do. It's not boring today. Absolutely. So I tend to be, kind of to converge all that, I tend to be very optimistic about the future of journalism, because I think technology is making it possible to do work like we've never done before in more imaginative and interesting ways. And I think that storytelling and reaching people out in the world is getting interesting and different, and I think that we're reinvigorated today. People think it's the worst time to do this work. I think the reverse is true. I think it's the best time to do this work.
And one thing that is sort of rehashed all the time is the divisiveness of our sort of our discussions when it comes to political issues and those types of things. And one issue that sits in there is the fact that people have sort of siloed themselves off, they've said, so here's my menu of what I want to choose and what I want to listen to and what I want to consume. How do objective, journalistic news stories, break that barrier to say, because that sensationalism, that telling the audience what they want to hear because of their political affiliation, that's going to drive ratings. Ratings, of course, drive revenue, et cetera. So how do you find that balance of continuing to sit in the middle, report the facts, but then actually break into or change people's minds or bring them back to that center position?
Well, you've asked exactly the right question. This is a remarkable moment as far as you said siloing. I would describe it as self-exiling. We all walk down the streets of the cities in which we live with headphones in our ears to keep the world out. We curate our satellite radio channels to be the things that we agree with, or the cable box we pick our preferred cable channel. It used to be that the newspaper was the public square, the safe space. Before that became a pejorative phrase, right? Where the community would come together, put their arms down, and they would look for things that they agreed on. It was kind of a place where you could meet people of unlike mind.
Sure.
And that's, the newspaper is no longer that, to the degree that anybody even reads the newspaper today. It's no longer that. You can go a day or a week or a lifetime, Paul, without encountering a point of view different from your own. We are the United States of confirmation bias. And I think that's devastating to our democracy. It's devastating to our communities. It exacerbates the things that you've described. We're in the business of doing nonpartisan journalism. There are people who doubt that that's even a thing. They say, well, that's like jumbo shrimp. It's an oxymoron. My view is you cannot persuade people without them actually seeing it, that you're serious about doing nonpartisan journalism. They doubt that it exists. They can't believe that you're serious and sincere. But actually, for 8 years, we've done it. We as an organization don't editorialize on issues. We don't endorse candidates or campaigns. We don't put our thumbs on the scale. There are plenty of places to go to tell you what to think. We don't need to be one of those. We do need to tell you to think, though. The distinction for us is people have plenty of places to go to be told, do this or vote that way or whatever else. But the real problem is civic engagement. People in our state, the state that we love, Texas, have checked out. We have the worst voter turnout over the last 4 elections of any state in the country. People don't know who their elected officials are at the Capitol in Austin. They certainly don't know about the fights going on in their names, or supposedly in their names. And they certainly don't know about the stakes that they have in the outcomes of those fights. The reality is that in Lubbock, in Levelland, in the Panhandle, West Texas, all over the state, schools matter, roads matter, healthcare matters, immigration matters. It matters every bit as much to somebody in Lubbock as it does to somebody in Austin. Somebody in Lubbock is every bit as much a Texan as somebody in Austin. In fact, arguably more of a Texan, because I'm from fake Texas, Austin. You're from real Texas in Lubbock. But we don't have access to equal amounts of information about what's happening. In Lubbock, you know less instinctively when you walk into the voting booth, or if you go to a community meeting about public education or healthcare, than you might know in the big cities, because there's more coverage of this stuff. Sure. There's an inequity in information. The issue is not partisan versus nonpartisan. The issue is engaged versus disengaged. And there are an awful lot of people in the state who are disengaged. And there are a lot of reasons for that. I think that redistricting is the big problem in terms of making elections non-competitive, so there's no motivation for people to turn out. They believe that if they live in a big Republican legislative or congressional district and they happen to be a Democrat, their vote doesn't count. They also realize if they're a Republican that their candidate's going to win whether or not they vote. I mean, this argument that the system is somehow rigged and you know the outcome of the election before it occurs, can you really argue with that? I think we in the media have a responsibility too. We haven't done a good enough job of telling people what's important enough for them to stop in their busy lives and pay attention to. But I also think, generally speaking, people are busier. You and I, Paul, are busier than our parents' generation was. We have more hours in the day that we spend working. We have many more distractions in the few hours that we have for leisure time. People are just not top of mind thinking, I know what I'll do. I'll spend a bunch of time thinking about it and reading about it and talking about the quality of public education or school finance or school choice, or what we should do with undocumented kids who were brought here through no fault of their own, or the fact that Texas has the most people without health insurance in the whole country. Nobody wants to talk about that stuff just organically, except for the few political nerds, and they all work for me who are in the state. But yet we have an obligation to get our fellow citizens, our friends and neighbors, to pay attention, because this stuff matters. Absolutely. So I tend not to really think about, to your question, I don't think about the polarization as the main hurdle to get over, or the main obstacle to be wired around, or the problem to be solved. I really think about the fact that people have just checked out, and we have to get them checked in.
And you're doing that. I mean, you're here in Lubbock for a very specific reason, the Texas Tribune event, and you hold those all over the state.
We do 50 events or more a year.
Wow.
Of different sizes, with certain aspects of them different from place to place, but the majority of the aspects of these events are the same. On the record, open to the public, free to attend. It's always elected officials, newsmakers, policymakers on a stage in front of an audience, being asked hard questions. They have to answer them because they can't get away. And then the audience, often people who they represent in office, get to ask questions. And again, in an environment in which there are not competitive elections, so just to make this specific to the question that you asked about this event tomorrow, Charles Perry, who is the state senator who represents this area at the Capitol, and the two state representatives from this area, or two of them who represent House districts. So you have Charles Perry in the Senate, Dustin Burrows and John Frullo, all Republicans of Lubbock. A meteor could fall on the Republican candidate or office holder and kill that person, and the corpse would still be the Democrat up here. I mean, there is not a chance.
That's a fair thing to say.
There is not a chance in heck that a Democrat's going to win those seats. The nature of the politics up here and of the politics of the state today, as opposed to 25 or 50 years ago, is what it is. So those guys don't have much of a motivation to do a lot of outreach to their constituents. Now, they'll certainly argue, well, we do outreach, but it's not the same as if you're running like you're going to lose, or you're running like you're nervous about things. There's not really this capitalism is this thing that we all embrace in the state of Texas and elsewhere. We love to have the free market and choices, Coke, Pepsi, right? Hamburgers, hot dogs. But when it comes to elections, we don't put a choice in front of people because of the way the system is constructed. So we consider our role to be to return that measure of accountability and that measure of visibility to communities where the political system is not really providing it organically, and to give people back home an opportunity to hear their elected officials, go on offense and defense and talk about the work that they do. And we think that's a positive thing. And it gets to, as you say, it's part of our model, it gets to this question of how you get people better engaged.
Absolutely, that engagement issue. What sort of response do you get from the community?
They love it. The funny thing about it is, you'd think that the biggest audiences that we'd get would be in the biggest population centers. We do fine in the big cities, but really the opportunity for us is when we go into smaller communities, the media deserts, where they're not having a conversation of this kind on a regular basis, really at all, unless we facilitate it.
It's mostly car crashes and weather on the local.
And those things are important and interesting. But if we go, I'll give you an example. Last year, in the first half of the year, we went out to Alpine, Texas, Sul Ross State University. What is Alpine? A community of 5,000, 7,000, 8,000. I'm telling you, we had 300 or more people turn out. We had to add tables. We always provide lunch for the people who come to these events, and so we had to add lunch. We go to Texarkana, as we did just a couple of weeks ago in East Texas, or you go to San Angelo, or you go to, I could name any. Nacogdoches, we've had an extraordinary turnout. These communities tend to turn out in significant numbers, in large measure because they're dying to have this conversation. They are concerned about the quality of the public schools. They are worried about the future of healthcare. They are concerned about the changing nature of the population and what it's going to mean to them, workforce and education and everything else. So I actually think the bigger opportunity is in a community where the population is smaller and where the coverage is less. We have always come to Lubbock and come to Tech because people in this community turn out for events like this. We expect to have a couple hundred people tomorrow, and that's great. And those people will walk away with a clearer sense of the fights being waged on their behalf, which is good.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Some breaking news today. Lamar Smith announced that he would...
Congressman from San Antonio.
Correct.
Veteran Republican congressman, chairman of the Science Committee on the U.S.
Absolutely. We are running out of time, but what does that say necessarily about the outlook of the House going into what everyone is saying 2018 is going to be a...
Well, so this is the second Texas congressman who is the chairman of an important committee to have announced he was not going to return in 2 days. Jeb Henseling from Dallas, East Dallas, announced that yesterday, and now Lamar Smith today. Those are both overwhelmingly Republican districts. It would be a huge shock if a Democrat could win either of those seats. On the other hand, if this ends up being a wave election, as sometimes happens, and the chaos that's happening right now in Washington and the questions about where this Russia investigation is going and what's what the president, nobody knows what the election environment is going to be a year from now. If it's a wave election because everything in Washington kind of combusts, then conceivably those things are. But I think the larger point is everything is in flux right now. And we're seeing a bunch of I mean, you also had just about a week ago the announcement by the Texas Speaker of the House, Joe Strauss, that he was not going to come back. And so we're going to see a fight for that position, significant leadership position in the Texas legislature. You know, the page is turning. A lot of the familiar characters are heading off stage for the last time, and we're going to see a bunch of new characters on the scene. And again, come back to where we began. That makes it more interesting. Absolutely. You know, there are going to be a lot of new stories to tell. We'll be there to tell them.
Great.
Good.
And one more question, because I'm just interested.
Sure.
Does Beto O'Rourke stand a chance?
I think, again, see my comment about
Same
the asteroid
thing.
or the
Okay,
meteor.
yeah.
But if the environment changes and you know, all of a sudden all bets are off, not only will he be in a competitive situation with Ted Cruz, but a whole bunch of races that right now we don't think in a million years could be competitive will be. Again, from a journalism standpoint, I'm pulling for competitive.
Yes.
But it'll be interesting regardless.
Excellent.
So, good.
All right. Evan
Thanks,
Smith,
Paul.
thank you so much for being here.
Okay.
All right.